Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to this Ipsos webinar on the ethics of AI and the role of public engagement. This session is going to run for 1 hour, so we'll finish up about 2 o'clock. And just to let you all know, it is being recorded. So my name is Ciaran Mulholland. I'm a research director at Ipsos in our Scotland team. And I lead on a lot of our public engagement work in Scotland, and in recent years that has covered a lot of projects that look at how our data is used and how that can be used safely and ethically. And in recent years, Ipsos has been increasingly doing a lot of work around how the public feel about AI in particular and how AI could and should be used. So that's what we'll be discussing today. Of course, AI is not new necessarily. The technology itself has existed for over a decade, but discussions around its use have gathered pace in recent years. We have seen the rise in the use of generative AI since the launch of ChatGPT in particular last year. And many of us, and I'm sure lots of you on the call, are either already using AI in your role or considering how it could be used. And the technology is developing rapidly. So it's creating lots of opportunities, but also raising lots of challenges and some specific ethical dilemmas. So the ethics of AI is what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. So I'm really delighted to be joined by a panel of colleagues and guest speakers. So I'll ask each of you actually just to introduce yourselves to everybody. So if I could just ask you to say your name and your role and how that fits within this broader topic of the ethics of AI and public engagement. So I'll maybe come to my colleague first. Rima, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Yes, I'd love to. My name is Rima Patel. I'm head of deliberative engagement at Ipsos, and one of the things that I've really been engaged in previous contexts has been establishing participation and engagement at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So I will say more about why I think you can't really talk about the ethics of AI without talking about deliberation in due course, but I won't launch straight into that. I just wanted to make that point that they're quite intertwined.
Thanks, Rima. A nice teaser for what's to come. Doreen, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, and thank you for the invitation. I'm Doreen Grove. I'm head of open government at Scottish Government. I'm also an archaeologist and historian, so why would you ask me about technology? And I will come back to that too. It is interesting to me that we think about the tech rather than the end result. So this is a really welcome discussion about why we want to use it as much as is it the right tool. Because like every other bit of tech, whether it's a hammer or a space rocket, it's still a bit of tech and a tool to be used.
Lovely. Thanks, Doreen. And Callum, next, please.
Hello, my name's Callum MacDonald. I am the Engagement and Participation Lead at the Scottish AI Alliance. We are the delivery body for Scotland's national AI strategy. So we're a partnership between the Data Lab, which is embedded in the University of Edinburgh, and the Scottish Government. And we work to deliver our vision, which is that Scotland becomes a leader in the development and use of AI, which is trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive. So we talk a lot about trust, ethics, and inclusion in AI every day. And in my role, the past year has seen me out working with community embedded groups and networks and finding out how they are coming to the conversations around AI and what would most benefit them and help them join the conversation in AI. We run the Scottish AI Summit, Scottish AI Register, and over the next 2 years, we have a refreshed remit to go bigger and bolder. I was in the role before ChatGPT came out, so the role has changed a wee bit.
Great, thanks. Thank you all. It's so great to have you join us. I'm going to just set the scene a little bit, first of all, before we open up for the panel discussion. So I'm going to talk through some data that Ipsos has collected around public attitudes to AI. Then we'll have the panel discussion, which will be most of today's session, but we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So please, everyone in attendance, please, if you have a question, just pop it in the chat function, in the Q&A function, and we will cover as many as we can. So allow me 1 second to bring up some slides. Okay. So where do the public stand on all of this? Well, we do have lots of data around this, but I'm just going to summarize some of the key themes that are relevant for today. So first of all, in terms of what the public know about AI, when we polled adults across the UK last year, it's safe to say that most said that they knew only a little bit about AI. So 59% said they know a little bit about AI. And 1 in 4 of us saying that we knew at least a fair amount, but only 4% saying that they know a lot about it. So, you know, that may have moved on since then, but it's safe to say that overall knowledge was, you know, relatively low. But what about how it's actually used? Well, we asked people how comfortable or uncomfortable they would be with AI being used for a range of different uses, a range of different tasks. And you can see here what people said, whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable against each of these different uses. And you can see that there's some openness to AI being used for tasks like improving traffic flow, identifying health risks and early signs of disease, identifying security threats, and some tailoring of learning materials and resources. But beyond that, there's a bit more of a mixed picture, and actually some uses that people feel more uncomfortable than comfortable with. So just to highlight some of those, in particular, people would be more uncomfortable with AI being used for key decisions like to assess whether or not someone is entitled to benefits or not, for personalizing of social media content, and for directing political content and advertising. That's going to become quite relevant over the next 5 weeks. So we have got, a sense that it really depends on what we're talking about. It depends on what the actual use is. But overall, the public tend to think that AI is more of a risk than an opportunity. That includes when we talk about its effect on the UK economy as a whole, them personally, but particularly UK society and the UK's national security. So we're more risk, we view it more of a risk than an opportunity overall. And actually, we've also asked about AI in other countries. So in our global survey of 31 countries, we asked about trust in AI. And Callum mentioned already about trust being one of the key terms around the AI strategy. But we asked whether they agreed with the statement, "I trust artificial intelligence to not discriminate or show bias towards any group of people." And just under half of people in Great Britain said that they did trust AI in that way. And that was lower than the global average, which ranges quite a bit, you can see, from 83 right down to 33%. But it indicates that we don't trust it as much as some other countries do. And that was the same whenever we asked about trusting AI with the privacy of our data as well. So we're not as trusting as other countries. And actually, when it comes to regulation, we felt that, or the UK public that we polled felt that, well, the AI regulation is developing slower than AI technologies. And 60% also said that they wanted the UK government wasn't doing enough for regulation of AI. So there's a clear desire for more governance and regulation around AI, and for it to be done more quickly than it is already. So a lot of these opinions are actually explained further in some of the public engagement work we've done, some of the deliberative engagement we've done. So we've recently carried out public dialogues and deliberative engagement on various topics related to the use of data and the use of AI. And a lot of these have been in the health setting, but not exclusively. But what we've found is, there's recognition of the benefits of AI. So it perhaps being more accurate, more precise, making decisions, helping to make decisions quicker, and being more cost effective in terms of the resource needed. But there are concerns, and the concerns are very complex. And in these types of public engagement exercises, deliberative exercises, we really get into the nitty-gritty of what those concerns are. But broadly, they are around, first of all, data privacy and any risk of our personal data being breached. The risk of bias, so whether AI will actually have bias and that it could impact on the way certain groups are treated. Whether decisions are made on data that's poor quality and whether AI could be doing that. And of course, risk to our own roles, to humans' roles. Will this replace us, essentially? So we find that there's there's a need for human involvement to be involved, for checks on the use of AI. We've recently discussed whether there's support for semi-automation more so than automation, and we find that people do tend to find that that is more palatable for them because there's a human involved. And then other broader themes that come out of these discussions are our ability to choose what happens, our ability to choose what happens with our data. And that opens up discussions around consent, which are themselves quite complex, but nonetheless important. The importance of inclusivity and fairness, so that certain groups, again, are not treated differently or decisions made about them in a way that's unfair. And overall, I think against all of this, the public tell us they want reassurance. They want reassurance about there's transparency in terms of how these decisions are made, how data is being used, and there's accountability. So who is actually doing this? Who is actually using the AI, and how would any misuse be checked? So that's a brief overview of some of the themes that have come out. But I'm going to pause there and open up for discussion from our speakers. And we're going to be looking at three broad areas, really, but we'll see where the discussion takes us. But we'll start off with what ethical issues does AI pose for government and public sector? We'll see, well, what would an ethical use of AI look like then? And I suppose, how do we get there? So how can public engagement in particular help to inform decisions about ethical use of AI? Okay, I'll come out of there so I can join my speakers again. Okay, so I'm going to open this up to you all now. So let's take that first question. So what are the ethical issues that AI poses? And particularly here, we're talking about for government and for public sector. And Doreen, if I could ask you to start us off, please, that would be great.
If I could add an S to the word government, because all governments face and all public sector organisations face the same sort of dilemmas. The role of government is to provide for the needs of the public. That's kind of our job, and how we do that and making sure we're doing it, making morally and ethically sound decisions really matters. I'm going to be a tad controversial in that, for me, being a bit more honest about what AI is and what it isn't would be helpful. I mean, I am with the sort of camp that says this is about machines that can look for patterns. That is really good and quick and does what it's told around looking for patterns and using that information quickly and effectively. But for any government, we need to be really thoughtful about where the information that creates that tool comes from. So if you already have a load of information that either favours or disfavours any particular bits of society, just reusing that to create a faster and better way of doing it is, of course, a real worry. So I loved your introduction, Ciaran, because some of the things that you raised are the things that we are very actively thinking about. And I work on open government internationally. So I see around the world countries looking at how we do this. So what are the rules and regulations you put in place? But also within government, how do you think about your own role and making sure where you are proposing to use something that it calls itself AI, do you understand it? Do you know what it is that you're going to be using it for? And can you be sure that the algorithm that is being applied is going to be as fair as it can be? So putting in place things as we have around registering algorithms, so you can actually see what the biases are, what the large language model was that sits behind it, so you can understand that. And I think for government, it's no different from any other form of decision making. We need to be thoughtful about the outcomes that we're looking for. Who is it needs to be involved? Who is it needs to be protected? And what is it we are trying to achieve? And setting all of those out in a way so you can make open and transparent decisions. So people can see who's made the decision. They can see where the information's come from. They can see and understand the implications for their lives of whatever we are using it for. I think all of those are heightened when we're talking about something that people already have a suspicion of, as you see in your statistics. But that is a matter I'm sure we'll come back to in this discussion. It is incumbent on us to make sure we are talking about it, that this doesn't become yet another bit of secrecy. That how we do it really matters, and how and who we involve in the decision making, in the application, in the holding to account. All of those things really matter.
Great. Thanks so much, Doreen, for kicking us off there. Rima, do you want to come in on this issue? So I suppose what particular ethical dilemmas or ethical issues are raised by AI?
Yes, a whole host of them in a public service context. So your talk picks up on a few, actually. So some around healthcare and the notion of predictive users, actually. I think it's really interesting. So using AI to predict and anticipate certain trends and patterns. So in the context of healthcare, that of course is something that people feel relatively comfortable about, the use of technology in order to improve healthcare application. But you can imagine a similar technology used in a sort of social welfare context or a childcare context that might have really challenging ethical ramifications. So, being able to sort of train data sets and AI tools to predict who's likely at risk of being, experiencing a safeguarding abuse, that itself is a deeply challenging use of AI and have been used by lots of local authority. The entire area of biometrics, facial recognition technology uses in policing and security has invited a lot of scrutiny from the European Commission through the EU AI Act. So certain uses now in the AI Act are considered high risk and therefore require audits and safeguards and self-governance mechanisms in place and implemented, and facial recognition technology is definitely in that category of users. There's also some really interesting uses that I spotted during the pandemic. I mean, some of them we've been involved in deliberating with the public on, including the use of the Q-COVID algorithm and its appropriateness and its application. The Q-COVID algorithm drew from a database called the Children Patient Database in order to make certain rapid response decisions about the prioritization of vaccines and the allocation of healthcare in the pandemic. And so these decisions that are being made using data sets invite public discussion and deliberation about, the best ways to implement and use and embed algorithmic tools and systems, and as Doreen's already mentioned, whether the data works for that purpose, and also who wins and who loses. And there's been a really interesting paper that was written by Adrian Weller at the Alan Turing Institute and Diane Core at the Bennett Institute, where they spoke about the challenges that AI presents for policymakers, because what it risks doing is masking some really difficult decisions that previously policymakers would have had to make, and they would have had to balance up lots of different interests and tensions. And the appeal of AI is that it almost takes that challenge away from the policymaker. But the big challenge is that it's not clear then who is making the decision. So one challenge is removed or taken away, and another set of challenges in the public service context is opened up, which is this question of how do we ensure that we're able to have a societal discussion about societal question. And that, of course, leads us down the road to participatory democracy very quickly, and the methods and the mechanisms we need to use to be able to do that. So AI is an extremely complicated field and area, and that requires a certain level of information, awareness, critical engagement with the tool and with the technology. And the last thing I will say is that there's something extremely interesting about how we want to think about AI as an extension of the tools that we've historically used in technologies, and the complexities that brings with it, i.e. as with any tool, AI seems to have a structuring element, i.e. it is involved in structuring society itself. The pandemic examples kind of give us that sort of sense of structuring. And so there's a question, which is, how do we want to actually organise society using these tools, or do we even want to do that? And there's a sort of high level conversation that we need to have about that as well.
Excellent, thanks, Rima. So much to reflect on there as well. Callum, I'll bring you in for the final part of this question. So again, any other ethical issues that spring to mind for you?
Yes, a lot of great points have been covered already, so I won't retrace anything. But I think that one ethical sort of issue to wrangle with is the hype around AI and like techno solutionism, and that are we using the right tools for the right tasks? Are we picking the right problems to solve with AI? A lot of the data and AI world come with amazing solutions to the table. Whether the problems are there for those solutions, like I think the public hasn't been brought in early enough in that to make that a more streamlined system. I think with other sort of ethical dilemmas around it is that the angle of like, if AI is to respect human rights, that extends to like workers' rights, and how are people going to engage with AI in practical terms? It's likely slightly not going to be working with like a image generation or video generation model. It's likely going to be welfare decisions being made about you, or an AI plugin for a process that you already use and work. And so this sort of creep towards more AI technologies where your data has been processed and used in another way creates a whole new layer of an aspect to the working life. And so I think there's also that ethical consideration to take in, is the impact of the rise of the use of AI on the workplace, not just how it makes jobs more efficient, but how it adds a whole new invisible layer of labour that the workers won't be recompensed for training AI systems. So I think there's huge layers of ethical considerations around AI, and yeah, I think 1 hour to talk about them's an interesting, fun challenge.
Yeah, and I suppose even more challenging is probably the next question, which is, what would an ethical use of AI look like? That's the sort of question we would pose to a group of participants in a deliberative engagement exercise after 18 hours of deliberation and learning and discussion. But in 10 minutes or so, what do you all think? And actually, I'll come to you first for that one, Callum. What would ethical use of AI look like for the public sector?
So I think from talking to people about what ethical AI looks or feels like to them, our vision is trustworthy, ethical and inclusive AI, but they're so overlapping, like the concepts are so overlapping, that for a lot of people to feel that the use of AI is ethical, it needs to be trustworthy, which we're looking at transparency, we're looking at accountability, we're looking at systems being protected from misuse, we're looking for explainability. But then specifically on ethics, we're maybe considering that it should reflect and respect our values. Like I touched on my first answer, it should be a rights-based approach. So like an ethical AI future would be a rights-based approach, and that extends to workers' rights, that extends to children's rights. And it should also be used to support our communities and our environment. If we're wanting Scotland to be fairer, more prosperous, more green, then what we're looking for is AI to be used for good. And I think that brings me back to, this is a wide range and set of technologies and techniques. Are we using the right tools for the right problems? Are we using it for good, or are we trying to build an AI system because that's what's in the zeitgeist at the moment? So how are we assessing whether or not we should, rather than just concentrating on all we could?
Yeah, almost like doing it because we can rather than because we should. Yeah.
And for me, it's ethical AI. It's about going beyond legal. So we already have sets of laws outlining how we use data, and everyone's favourite 4 letters, GDPR, and how that extends to AI is interesting, and the ICO has really interesting sort of advice and work around that. But workplaces aren't at the cutting edge of how AI technologies impact data use, and so I think there's a lot of, for ethical AI, there needs to be more of a consideration of that how you approach how you use AI under GDPR. Like if it's Microsoft Word, that's very different from an AI plugin in Microsoft Word. So there's the added layer means we should be taking a closer look at how we approach it, I think.
Great, thanks, Callum. Doreen, I'll come round to you now for this. So if you could describe an ethical use of AI, what would it look like?
I'm not sure I would describe a single one, but what I would do is absolutely support what Callum just said about it being rights-based. There is no point in using new technology to perpetuate existing power imbalances. We have to be really thoughtful about what that means in how we're putting rules and regulations around the way we use it. And I absolutely agree. In fact, techno-solutionism is going to become my new phrase. It is something we see. And society, I said I was going to come back to archaeology. I'm sorry, I am. Human beings have a terrible record of not recognizing when technology has changed our lives. It doesn't matter whether you're moving from the Iron Age to from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, or from a pre-digital era to a digital era. We are absolutely rubbish at stopping to think about what it is we want to do. Rima, you were very clear that we need to be thoughtful about what it is we want from this, both as a society, but also as organizations. And the idea that it will land magically and suddenly run well is just arrant nonsense. You just need to look at any previous experience. But human beings have a remarkable talent for not looking at the past and learning from it. That rights-based solution is really important. It can help. With us being much more intersectional, really properly thinking about how all of these little bits fit together. But I come back to it. For me, what it looks like is a system that people trust. There is no point in building a new system that people remain wary of. So our job is to think about how we make sure that we're transparent, how we are promoting it, how we are listening when people say, don't mind it doing work on the traffic, but you're not going to track my health and social care. You're not going to tell the police when I go to a mosque or to a church. You know, some of these areas where there is real concern around the over-policing of the population. There has to be a two-way trust. So they have to trust, people in your population need to be able to trust our use of it. And in order for them to do that, they need to be able to see how we're doing it, what we're using it for. They need to be able to interrogate that and understand where it comes from. But we also need to be able to trust the population. So it is a two-way conversation, and we'll get back to conversations in a minute, because that, for me, has to be the answer. If we are, as a society, going to use this in the places where we think it can help collectively, and not in the places where we think it is undermining individuals or indeed organizations, it is incumbent on us to be really straightforward in how we communicate that, and how we are constantly checking ourselves and asking the question. I would put myself at the bottom end of the 59% of even understanding the tech around AI. So I think there is a real question of how you have those conversations, because they're the ones that really matter. If we're going to find the places in our system where this can make a huge difference, I'd really like somebody to use AI in checking photographs of cancer. They are much quicker than most human beings, and they're probably more accurate. So you know, there are places where this is extraordinarily important, and that we should be really promoting it, but that has to come with all the caveats and checks and balances that we've all mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you, Doreen. And finally, Rima, for you, what does an ethical use of AI look like?
So it's a great question. I think there's probably 3 points I'd make in relation to that. The first relates to the outcome. So when the AI has been used, has it generated some benefit out there in the world, or has it not? or even worse, has it generated harm? So I think that's always an important question I'm asking myself when I'm looking at the use and implementation of AI. And I suppose before it's been implemented, sometimes it's hard to predict or foresee that. But you know, as a developer, as a government organisation, you can think about it from that perspective. Did it actually overall contribute to positive outcomes or not? Linking back to Doreen's points about the role of government. The second is actually about the process or the systems or how we get to the outcome. So even if the outcome itself was really beneficial, if the rights of minority groups were trampled all over, or data was used where it shouldn't have been used, and or I don't know, scraped off the internet or collated in dubious way, that's a kind of more of a systematic or a process-oriented question, but that in and of itself really would undermine public confidence and trust in the outcomes, regardless of whether the outcomes were great or not. And then the third point, I think, relates to the sort of society we want to see, which is this notion of human capabilities enabled, empowered to be able to shape change in the world. So again, even if you've got amazing outcomes and you've got a fairly responsible process, if people's agency is undermined or diminished, or there is a part of a supply chain in another part of the world that is extracted from or exploited to deliver those outcomes, then these are all questions that we need to consider and think about. So I'd sort of say a three-part approach, which is looking at the result, the outcomes, looking at the process, and also looking at the broader societal impact. And last but not least, there's also something about the involvement of the groups impacted and not impacted in some instances by the technology. So had this been done in a top-down way, or has it being co-produced in a bottom-up way? Well, these are also important questions to ask when it comes to the ethical use of AI, because the likely result of co-production is the outcome, the process, and the capacity and empowerment questions are answered. But without that, it's really difficult to see how policymakers and other organisations can meaningfully understand and anticipate the issues that they need to respond to, and therefore how they might be able to ensure that they're acting in ethical ways.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. That leads us to the public, those people impacted by AI, those people not impacted by AI, the public, which we know is a big group.
And
let's talk
all
about
of us.
It does. That's us. Yeah. So what about public engagement then? So how can public engagement help with all of these challenges we've been discussing? So how can it help to inform decisions about ethical use of AI? And this time, Rima, I might come to you first. So if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the way I think about public engagement, I think about it as mediating power relations between people and wider structures. So in this case, industry developing and deploying the technology, and also government organisations who have power, and different people, different groups have different levels of power. And so if we look at Arsene's ladder of participation paper, she was very clear that good engagement, good public engagement aims to shift power dynamics and power structures. And so that's a really interesting question in the context of AI, because as we've all spoken about already, it has the potential to feel incredibly disempowering. So the role of public engagement in relation to AI is about shifting what feels like a very disempowering conversation towards a much more empowering conversation. So that's my take on that question, but I'm really keen to hear now from Doreen and Callum, who I think have their own perspective from industry and policy context.
Yeah, thanks, Rima. Callum, I'll come to you then. What's your take? How can public engagement help with this, with these decisions?
I think oftentimes it's a question sort of framed around like, well, if you're going to be very deliberative and have a lot of engagement to do things slower, then is that not missing out on sort of innovative business opportunities and the benefits of moving fast? But I think like public engagement allows the whole system to be fairer. If we're going through an industrial revolution 4.0 or whatever buzzword we're calling it, then that's a huge technological change, and the most important part of technological change is like people and bringing people along on that change. Else, why build a system that is unfair? Why entrench inequalities in the world? And public engagement, community engagement, conversations work to work against that. And it's a difficult process that organizations, institutions that have the power often don't have the adaptive capacity to. They can write co-creation workshop in big bold at the top of papers really easily, but then to actually take that advice on board and change and move is difficult. So I think it's something that needs to happen internally at organizations and institutions for that learning to come through. And I think that's where it's important for places like third sector and the creative industries should be in the conversation, because they do it really well. And so the data and AI world, I think there'll be huge benefit from understanding that innovation isn't just like glowing blue brains and neon. The innovation is within conversations and the communities that make Scotland a special place, and it's in sort of making the world better one relationship at a time, and sort of making sure that relationship is meaningful and it has impact. And so if the future relies on AI, the progress of AI being so fast we can't have these conversations, then do we want a future that relies on AI harms? I don't. So I think without public engagement around AI, we won't have a robust environment to realise the benefits of AI.
Thanks, Callum. Finally, Doreen, what do you think then? Why is public engagement important for this particular topic and helping address these challenges?
So I'm going to give you an example that sort of stays in my mind. As we went into COVID, one of the things I was asked to do was look at a trust framework, ethics framework for how Scottish Government made decisions around how we use data in order to manage the pandemic. And it was really an extraordinarily interesting experience. We had a lot of very difficult decisions to make very quickly, and my colleagues were very keen that they were made in a kind of knowing way and understanding the scale of impact and that kind of thing, and where there were potential harms. And Rima helpfully was part of that discussion. One of the things that we put in place was a framework which basically said, do you know what the public thinks of this? And if you don't know the answer, you've got to go and bloody well ask them. And that actually is really the fundamentals of all this. Unless you know how the public are going to respond, then you actually don't know whether they trust you with it. They don't know whether you are doing the right thing. It feels really basic to me. This is very important work. And finding ways of making some of the drudge of how we do business better with this new tool is all very well. But if people don't trust it, we're just going to go around a loop of people being more and more suspicious. So the answer for me is back to trust and transparency. But that transparency is, there's no point in that if you're going to hide things on a government website. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't spend my evenings combing a government website. We have to go out and talk to people about it, as Callum has been, going into society, going into communities and saying, so what does this mean to you? What are the places and ways you would find it useful, and building on that. But it can't be just the techie guys around the table. It can't be just people who either do or don't want it. The joy of deliberation is that you get people from a really wide range of views, and you are testing something with them, giving them an understanding, and can then they come to a much more informed decision. And that, for me, when you're using something like AI or any use of people's data, being thoughtful about how we do that, where we do it. We can't do it for every single thing, so we need to be proportionate. We need to look at the places and ways that this technology is going to help us and target those with really careful, deliberative processes. So our trust framework was applied through COVID decision making. Lots of projects used it. And because we couldn't ask the question during COVID, because all of these decisions were made kind of overnight, we came back and tested that with the public. So Science-Wise and yourselves, Ipsos, were involved in doing some of that, asking the question. So did we get those decisions right? So even if you aren't able to do it in double quick time, I mean, I kind of understand what you say, Callum, about technology moving so fast that, you know, it's in position before you know. But public procurement is slow of any sort, so there is time, and we need not to think of this as an afterthought, but as part of how we develop anything. That proportionate look at who is most badly affected. And if you go to the people furthest from government, you'll pick everybody else up on the way back in. And really being thoughtful about how you have rooms for those conversations, both inside government and outside, and making it really just the way we do our business, to try and be really thoughtful in how you're developing a project. So that might be ideation, it might be all sorts of ways of involving the public, looking for ideas, looking at co-design or co-production, but also going back to the public and say, did we get it right? So a little bit more around the accountability, where we have a change in technology, I think would be a really good investment in time and thought. So we can then come back and say, well, you know, we didn't get it quite right. Sorry about that. We will take those lessons and learn for the future.
Thanks, Doreen. And actually, just to pick up on that with my own reflections, I think what we often find through deliberative public engagement is that the public are ready to hear the difficult decisions that have to be made. they accept that perhaps government, public sector don't have all the answers and sometimes get it wrong and do have budgetary constraints and challenges, but they want to understand those and then hear, well, how have you come to the decisions? How have you actually brought the public's views on board? How transparent are you being? How accountable are we being held? So yeah, it's that honesty again, that transparency. Okay, thanks. We could go on, but I'm conscious that we may have some questions for you all. So we have a question about the public engagement side actually. So on public engagement, how can we best engage children and young people in these discussions? Callum, I saw you raise your hand. Would you like to come in on that? Is that something you've done much? Yeah.
So we have been working on a project with Children's Parliament around children and AI for the past 2 years. Children's Parliament are world-leading experts on children's rights, and they were the best. It's like going to the best of the best to solve a very difficult solution, to solve a very difficult problem. And over the past 2 years, Children's Parliament, ourselves and the Alan Turing Institute have been investigating this exact question: how can we best engage children and young people in these discussions? So the phase 1 of the project, the sort of interim report, is already out. You can find it on Children's Parliament's website. Stage 2 just wrapped up, and we have a call to action sharing event next week around it, where we're bringing our members of Children's Parliament in to meet the robots and the decision makers, and they're going to share their calls to action, and then we'll be shouting about them. Things which come across as the children say, we need to know, like they want AI education, they want to be AI literate or AI fluent, however you want to put it. They think that the learning about AI is very important. But I would say, like, wait for the sort of final stage 2 report of that, and you can hear from the children themselves. You can also at Scottish AI Summit, the children were our plenary panel guests, and you can find the recording of them sharing their thoughts around AI. They were platformed to talk to the AI industry about what they think about AI after a year of learning about it with Alan Turing Institute. And they also got a chance to question members of the Scottish Government about it, which was a lot of good fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would love to have been there. Thanks, Callum. So we can look forward to seeing more on that then. I'll actually just move on to another question, if that's okay, and maybe bring in Rima or Doreen on this. So we've got a question that asks about what is the most useful use of AI that you've seen until now, and what made it ethical. But I guess that's if it was. And any examples of just really useful use of AI that you can think of?
Go on, Rima, you're better at cool things than me.
So I mean, in terms of usefulness, you can't go too far away from the generative AI LLM tools. In terms of the ethics, well, I think that's a different conversation. So is the question useful and ethical? Because I think we're really narrowing the frame down, and I think that in and of itself does something. Or is it just useful? So, I mean, LLMs are extraordinarily flexible. So in terms of their ability to adapt to different users and contexts and applications, and that's what generated interest really in AI in a way in which it hadn't been generated before. And that's really interesting. Up until that point, you did see users of AI, but very much single use and single purpose context. Single use, single purpose context. I think that because their uses are much more controllable, they're more likely to be more ethical. I think the less multi-purpose the use, the less likely it is to be able to control, and therefore the less likely it is to be ethical. So I think there's a sort of interesting tension here that we have between how we develop these AI, the more we can foresee the use, the easier it is going to be to regulate and control. The less we can foresee the use, and it's down to anyone to do what they want to do with it, then, you know, actually it's going to be much harder to sort of govern and regulate and anticipate and control. So I want to sort of say that that's probably one for our next discussion, but that's my immediate reaction to your question. How can we do both useful and ethical? For us, that's the tension and the challenge.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Rima. I'm going to squeeze in this question. It's a big one, though. So, how does government respond to how do governments respond to the pros and cons of AI in the context of elections, with half the world going to the polls this year? Doreen, do you have any take on that?
We are in pre-election period. So I'm certainly not going to talk about our current position. But what I would say that democracy internationally is at risk, and we need to be really thoughtful about how we cherish and nurture the democracy that we have. I think that is probably far more than just technology. It is really about how, it's back to Rima's point of the kind of society we want. We need to be much more active in creating the kind of society that we want to live in, and you know, be really thoughtful about that. But I'm sorry, I can't, in pre-election period, I really can't talk about any specifics.
Understand. That's absolutely fine. Thank you, Doreen.
In the tower.
Yes. Well, listen, we only have a minute left, so I'm just going to wrap things up. That was absolutely fascinating. We could have kept talking. The big takeaways I've heard are about, well, that point, actually, you just reiterated, Doreen. What society do we want? Yeah. And that's the context in which we make these ethical decisions, but also that idea of a rights-based approach. That's come up a few times as well. And also, I think, Doreen, you mentioned we don't want to see AI repeat unfair decisions or structural inequality, and there's an opportunity for it to not do that. So, so having these discussions and involving the public, that's the key thing, is what we should be doing. Before we leave, I'm going to very quickly do, it's a bit of a plug, but it's more just if you want more information, that there's lots of resources around what we've just been discussing. And two in particular that you'll find on the Ipsos website is this report on debating responsible AI, very much what we've been talking about, but that was based on some interviews with some leading experts in the field. So do have a look at that. And the other is a collection of information and an article on the future of AI in public services that our very own Rima and other colleagues contributed to that, including an interview with the Alan Turing Institute. So do have a look at those. There's lots of other Ipsos data on the website too.
And follow Rima on Twitter.
Yes. I'll come out again so I can see everyone. Okay, listen, thanks for joining us, everybody. And thanks very much to Callum, Doreen and Rima for joining us. It's been great.